For almost all of human history, the night was not something you slept straight through. It was the most alive, the most dangerous, the most deeply human part of the day. And then, in the space of a few short decades, we flipped a switch and erased it. Tonight, I want to take that switch back off and show you what your ancestors actually did in the 12 dark hours we have forgotten. Start before there was any light at all. For hundreds of thousands of years, before our ancestors mastered fire, human beings spent something close to half of their entire lives in a darkness they could not push back. When the sun went down, the world simply closed. And then, somewhere around 400,000 years ago, we learned to keep a flame alive, and everything changed. Not just because we could finally see, because for the first time, the night had a center. That center was the fire, the hearth. And for the rest of human history, almost everything after sundown happened inside the small, trembling circle of its light. Picture it. A single flame, or a candle so expensive that most families burned it sparingly, throwing a pulsing glow that could never quite reach the corners or the ceiling. People moved through their own homes by memory and by touch, their hands reading walls they could not see. The light was just enough for the things that did not need sharp eyes. And the thing it was best for, the thing that filled those hours more than any other, was telling stories. This is something we have almost completely lost. Night after night, generation after generation, the hours after dark were when human beings talked. They told stories by the fire, the same tales worn smooth by 1,000 retellings, passed down by living voices instead of pages. Your sense of who your people were, where you came from, what the world meant, most of it arrived in the dark, in the firelight, from someone older than you. The night was the original library, and its books were people. But step outside that circle of light, and the night became something else entirely. It became fear. For most of human history, people genuinely dreaded the hours after sunset, and they were not being foolish. The darkness held real dangers and imagined ones, stitched so tightly together you could not tell which was which. There were thieves and wild animals, and the simple risk of a broken leg in a world with no streetlights and no help coming. And then there were the other things. The demons, the spirits, the restless dead that nearly every culture placed firmly out in the dark. Towns rang curfew bells. Gates were locked at dusk. To walk out into the night was to take your life, or at least your soul, into your own hands. The dark was not empty. It was full, and most of what filled it wanted something from you. So people stayed in, close to the fire, and they slept. But here is where the past stops looking like a dimmer version of our own lives and starts looking like another world completely. Because your ancestors did not sleep the way you do. They slept twice. A historian named Roger Ekirch spent years digging through old diaries, court records, medical books, and poems, and he kept finding the same thing over and over in more than 2,000 references across a dozen languages. For most of Western history, people slept in two separate halves. They would go to bed a couple of hours after dark, around 9 or 10, and fall into what they actually called their first sleep. They would sleep deeply for 3 or 4 hours. And then, a little after midnight, they would wake up, not by accident, on purpose. This was simply how the human night was built. And in between the two sleeps, there was a window. An hour, sometimes longer, of quiet wakefulness in the dead middle of the night, with the whole world dark and still around them. In some places, they had a name for it, the watch. And what people did inside that window might be the most human hour we have forgotten how to have. Some of them stayed in bed and simply lay there, in a calm, drifting, half-dreaming state, and thought. They turned over the dreams they had just had, while the images were still warm and close enough to touch. Doctors of the time actually advised people to use this hour to reflect, and advised couples to use it to be together, because the body was rested and unhurried in a way it never was at the end of a long working day. Many children, historians believe, were conceived not late at night, But in that quiet hour between the two sleeps, others got up. They tended the fire, checked on the animals, looked in on a sick child. They prayed, long and slow, in the kind of silence you can only find at 1 a.m. Some rose to do small chores by the embers. And a few, the records tell us, even slipped out to visit a neighbor, because they knew the neighbor would be awake too, in the very same window, in the very same watch. The whole sleeping village shared a secret hour that almost none of us today are ever taught existed. Then, when the watch was over, they went back to bed, fell into their second sleep, and rode it gently down to the dawn. 2 sleeps, with a doorway in the middle. For thousands of years, this was simply what a night was. Not broken sleep, not insomnia, the natural expected shape of human rest. And then came the light. Not firelight this time. Bright, cheap, endless artificial light. First gas, then the electric bulb, and within a few short decades the entire structure of the human night quietly collapsed. Light pushed bedtime later and later. The night stopped being something to survive and became something to fill. The watch, that quiet hour between sleeps, got squeezed out of existence until our 2 sleeps fused into one solid block, and we forgot the seam had ever been there. We even forgot the fear. A child today can grow up and never once feel that specific ancient dread of true darkness, because true darkness is now something most of us have to travel a long way to find. We gain something enormous, of course, but it is worth sitting just for a moment with what we quietly set down. The fire that pulled everyone into one circle, the stories that only the dark could hold. The shared hour after midnight when a whole village lay awake, alone together, thinking and praying and loving in the quiet. Your ancestors knew that hour intimately. They had it every single night. And here is the part that lingers. Sleep scientists have found that when you put modern people into long, dark nights with no artificial light, after a few weeks, their sleep often splits entirely on its own, back into 2 pieces, with a calm, wakeful window in the middle. The old pattern is still in you. It never disappeared. We just buried it under 100 years of light. So tonight, when you finally turn everything off, and the room goes properly dark, and maybe somewhere past midnight you find yourself awake for no reason at all, staring up into the black and waiting to fall back asleep, do not reach for your phone. Do not be afraid. And do not fight it. You might just be standing in the doorway your ancestors walked through every night of their lives. The watch is still there. The only thing that ever changed is that we stopped knowing what it was for.